Thank you for being here. It's an honor. I would like to take it a bit back to a TED Talk a long time ago that I listened to, where you talk about traveling, living in different countries, various places that you studied. And I would like to know, how has that formed you as an author, as a human being? Because you talk about this global identity, talk about these times we live in, the liquid times. So how important was it for you as a young author and a woman to travel?
Thank you so much. It's really very nice to be here. I am excited to share the same stage. I think it had a big impact on me, living in different cities, countries, cultures. I was born in France, in Strasbourg, to Turkish parents. And the first house that I came to, at least in my mind, in my memory, is a house actually full of immigrants, leftist students, smoking gouloirs, lots of tobacco in the air, reading Althusser, you know, Jean-Paul Sartre, Frantz Fanon, but not Simone de Beauvoir.
No.
And talking about revolution, believing that the revolution was soon to arrive. So that was the first environment. But afterwards, my parents' marriage collapsed, and my father stayed in France. My mother brought me to Turkey, to Ankara. For her, it was motherland. For me, it was a new country to discover. And we came to my grandmother's neighborhood in Ankara. And this was a very conservative, very patriarchal neighborhood. And I remember it vividly because it left an impact on me. My mom, when she came back as a young divorcee, she had no diploma, no money, no career. And usually women in that position are immediately married off to someone older. And it was my grandmother who intervened and said, no, my daughter should go back to university. She should have a career, choices. And until my mom did exactly that. She graduated, she became a teacher, she became a diplomat. But all those years, I was raised by my grandmother. The reason I'm mentioning this is because I was raised by two women, which was a bit unusual in Turkey at the time. And they're very different people. My mom is very westernized, very secular, very modern, rational, urban. My grandmother, pretty much all the opposite boxes. Yeah. So more irrational, you might say, less educated, but very wise. And more traditional. But I think what left a big impact on me was the solidarity, the sisterhood between these two women. Yeah. I'm a big believer in sisterhood, the need for that, for women from different backgrounds. And that's how it started. After that, I lived in Spain, Jordan, Germany, back to Turkey. Yeah. I lived in Boston, Michigan, Arizona, back to Istanbul. And I lived in London in the last 10, 11 years almost. If I may add this, I think it's an important conversation because we're being told by particularly extremists that we can only be one single thing, that we can only have one identity, and we need to stick to our identity. I think that's wrong, and we need to fight against that. I think we need to defend multiplicity. For me, it's a very important part of my work.
Yes. And of course, Istanbul, where you wrote a lot of your novels.
Yeah.
Thank you. I just wanted to have that as a starting topic for the conversation, because reading this extremely well written and strong, I mean dark, raw, without filter, these words, the characters are displaced in a sense. And you have so many feelings that I relate as a reader, first of all, as a male as well. And at first I was like, okay, there's a story of love, there's a story of friendship, a story of smells, the streets. But there's also this story which connected to me was a story of pain. The tolerance of pain in women especially. The story of Layla. What that led me to think about is that the ugliness that comes out in your writing. How, as an author, you just sit down and write this pain that you transmit in the story, especially of Layla. I'm thinking about the different pains at different stages of her life. Could you speak a little bit about the pain? How it was?
I think, of course, as a writer, as a novelist, you're always interested in stories. But I believe we're equally interested in silences, the things we cannot talk about easily. So that includes political taboos, cultural taboos, and sometimes sexual taboos. We should be able to talk about these issues. And I believe in my work, there's always a desire to bring the periphery to the center, perhaps to try to give a bit more voice to people who are voiceless, perhaps to remind people of the stories that we have forgotten or erased or censored. To me, it is important. I come from Turkey. I come from a country that has a very rich history, that has a very long history, but at the same time, we are a society of collective amnesia. We have no memory of the past. We erase stories all the time. And if I may add this, one of the places that motivated me when I was writing this book is an actual place in Istanbul. It's a graveyard, and the Turkish translation would be the cemetery of the companionless. That's what we call it. This is a place on the outskirts of Istanbul, and unlike any other graveyards, in this one there are no names, no surnames, no tombstones. There are only wooden placards with numbers. And when those numbers disappear, everything disappears. So it's an actual place where real people become numbers. And when you research who are the people buried there, most of them are LGBTQ members, sexual minorities. Many of them, some of them, are AIDS patients, people who have died of AIDS throughout 1980s and 90s because of the stigma. They have been rejected. There are abandoned babies, there are suicides, and also there are an increasing number, there's an increasing number of refugees. We always read about refugees who drown when the boats capsize in the Aegean or the Black Sea, when they're trying to cross to Europe. Where are all these bodies taken? Hundreds and hundreds of dead bodies. They're taken to the cemetery of the companionless. So it is a very sad place. It's a very painful place where an Afghan refugee or a Syrian refugee might be buried next to a Kurdish sex worker or a Turkish bisexual or gay citizen. And I wanted to take at least one of those numbers, give it a name, give it a surname, give it a story, and reverse the process. I'm mentioning this because I think literature does that. It tries to rehumanize people who have been dehumanized.
Yeah, and I think that's what really interesting in this story, the invisible pain that you, as a reader, experience throughout the book, is that how society, how the structural oppression is, how you involve that in the writing, that we as human beings, when we walk around in society, we don't notice this. But in true literature, it was very strong. But it also seems like it's a critique of the social norms and societies in this book. As you give them voices. You always say that I want to give the voice to the voiceless. How do you feel, you as, when you're telling these stories, do you force to empathize the reader to understand the pain? Do you think that's important?
You can't force or push people, right? I think that's not a writer's job. But I believe our job is to ask primarily questions, difficult questions about difficult issues. Just to be able to say, why is it like that? Can we please talk about it? Can we please think about it again? And then always you have to leave the answers to the reader, because every reader's reading is going to be personal, individual, and unique, like our fingerprints. I know married couples who read the same book, they don't get the same pleasure or they don't connect with the same characters, because the reader is not a passive human being. We create the story together. But that said, I want to share this with you. In Turkey, I have a very diverse readership. And among my readers, there are people of all walks of life. To me, this matters because we're a very polarized country. So when I look at the people waiting in line, of course, there are many liberals, secularists, there are many feminists, Turks, Kurds, Alevis, Jews, Greeks. That matters to me. At the same time, I have many conservative readers. I have many readers also who are wearing headscarves, the hijab. I have also some nationalist readers as well. So when people come to me, I realize some of my readers can be very xenophobic. So if you ask their opinion about Armenians, Greeks, Jews, Kurds, the main minorities in Turkey, in the public space, they might tell you stereotypes. I have many readers who are very homophobic or transphobic. Again, because this is the way we are raised in Turkey. We're a very homophobic society. That is the only narrative you hear at home. But then the same people come and say, you know, I read your book, and this is the character that I love the most. And maybe the character they're talking about is a sexual minority or an ethnic minority. So I thought about this a lot. How is it possible that people who are more biased in the public space, when we are reading a novel, when we are alone, right? When we go into that inner space, we are a little bit more ready to connect with the other and to empathize with the other. I don't think that's a coincidence. And I also believe that all totalitarian regimes rely on collectivistic identity, you know, synchronized energy, everybody chanting at the same time. You need to erase individuality for totalitarianism to flourish. So I think art does the opposite. It reminds us of our individuality, not in a selfish way, but hopefully in a way that helps us to connect with the rest of the humanity.
Yeah, very fascinating. But has that been an ambition in your writing? To create these sort of movement that you are creating? I mean, I was looking at Twitter yesterday, and there are things happening in Turkey right now with women, with transgender people.
Yeah.
Doesn't it, there comes a pressure with this as an author? I mean, you're an activist and an author, and you put a lot of emphasis on your activism and your feminism. What pressure do you feel when you do this? I mean,
I think we never had that luxury. If you happen to be a storyteller from a wounded democracy, like Turkey, like Venezuela, Brazil, Nigeria, Egypt, Pakistan, imagine the list is so long, and the list is getting longer. If you happen to be a writer from such countries, you don't have the luxury of being non-political. You can't say, you know, I'm only going to write my stories. I don't want to talk about what's happening outside the window. Also, I'm a feminist. One of the many wonderful things that I have learned from the feminist movements of past generations is very simple but fundamental. Politics is not only about political parties, it's not only about parliament. Wherever there's power, there is politics. Right. So there's also politics in our kitchens, in our private space, and in that regard, sometimes writing about sexuality can also be a political act. If you describe politics in such a broad way, again, you can't be non-political. But I want to share with you one small observation. I think after the year 2016, after Brexit happened, Trump happened, after we've seen the rise of populist nationalism in country after country, I think many Western authors have begun to feel the same way. There's an urgency to respond. You don't have to write political novels, but we have to speak about core democratic issues and the loss of these, or the dangers of losing these core values. I think there are issues like rule of law, like freedom of speech, like women's rights, like LGBT rights, about which we cannot remain silent.
You have said that storytellers should be guardians of truth. Could you elaborate on that?
I don't want to sound like, you know, I'm giving too much of a social role to literature. But what interests me is at an age in which we talk about post-truth, whatever that means, at an age in which we talk about alternative facts, whatever that means, in an age in which the line between fact and fiction is blurred, paradoxically, maybe fiction writers have to defend truth louder. This is the age we're living in. A small example, and it worries me. Maybe you've come across this. It happened in France during the elections. Yeah. There was a moment when Macron, like many politicians, he goes to a factory, he starts speaking with the workers there, and the workers are cleaning fish. They're gutting eel. It's a very messy job. He rolls up his sleeves. As he's chatting, he's cleaning fish with them. And then he washes his hands. He shakes hands with the workers, factory workers, and then he leaves the factory. The far right, the alt-right in France took this video, they edited the video, they shortened the video, and in the new video there's no fish, there's no eel. And in the new video, what happened afterwards is replaced with what happened prior. So in the new video, Macron goes to a factory, he shakes hands with the workers, he looks at his hands as if he's disgusted, he goes and he washes his hands, and he leaves the factory, and the caption says liberal elite. Now, I'm not saying, you might be critical of Macron, you might be a supporter of Macron. I will respect you either way. That's up to you. But what I'm saying is we should all be concerned about the loss of truth. If truth is being attacked and eroded like this in a very deliberate, systematic way, and if digital technologies are being used for that sinister purpose, I think we all need to be aware of that danger.
Yeah, thank you. That leads me to another aspect that you also talked about, is identity politics.
Yeah.
If we need to come together across borders, across nationalities, you have said that it could be a good starting point, but it cannot be our destination.
No.
And I think a lot of young people today are very, not confused, but they are trying to find their place.
I know.
So could you elaborate on that quote? Like, what do you mean that, how would you take your message to these young people who are finding their identity?
Yeah, first of all, I have a lot of respect, particularly for the young generation today. I think they're facing an unprecedented level of anxiety, existential anxiety, more than the previous generations. Whether it's the ecological changes, threats, climate change, political uncertainties, economic uncertainties, job insecurity, there's a lot on their plate. But my answer is, I understand that existential anxiety, but the answer to that is not identity politics, and that worries me. I lived in Boston for a while, and when I was there, it was so cold. I was constantly in the library, in the archives, and that gave me a chance to read a lot about the African-American women's movement of 1960s and 1970s.
Yeah.
And it left an impact on me. Many of these women, because they were women of color, they were on the receiving end of racism. Because they were women, they knew how sexism and misogyny worked. Because many of them were LGBT members, they knew how homophobia worked or transphobia worked. But at the same time, many of them came from disadvantaged backgrounds. They weren't born with a silver spoon. And they knew how class discrimination, educational inequality worked in America. So when they talk about power, they talk about power in a much more nuanced way than we do today. And when you read people like Audre Lorde, or also James Baldwin, from a different background, but similarly, there's an emphasis on multiplicity. So these people say, look at me, I'm a mother, I'm black, I'm a woman, I'm a poet, I'm many more things you might not be able to see at the first glance. I contain multitudes. Now, fast forward year 2019, I think we forgot to say, I contain multitudes, because we're retreating into identity politics. But my worry is the answer to one kind of tribalism is not forming another kind of tribe of our own. We have to find a way to go beyond tribes. And there's a reason why people like Erdogan or Viktor Orban or Trump, all the populist demagogues love to divide societies. They love polarization. We need to do better. We need to find a way to go beyond echo chambers, and I think that's going to be one of the biggest challenges for progressive-minded people. How do you go beyond your own echo chamber? How do you find the language to connect with people who think differently and who vote differently?
Yeah.
But we need to see that challenge and accept that challenge.
Interesting. And that leads me to another area in the same aspect, and it is that I grew up in a vulnerable socioeconomic area, where there were masculinity norms which are prevalent, and for them, feminism, activism is corrosive. They do not understand it, and I guess we have the privilege of reaching out to those young men. It could be in Denmark, it could be in France, it could be anywhere. How do we carry our message to those who are not have the privilege to study or to learn or to go to the textbook? Read Baldwin. I mean, he's a dark optimist, just like you, I think, in a way.
Right.
But what could you talk about that?
You know, I think, and I really appreciate the question, I think we were subjected to two extremist narratives that feed each other. On the one hand, when I look at the far right in Europe, they are saying, well, if you come from a Muslim background, you can't really embrace LGBT rights, you can't really embrace feminism, you can't, because it's not in your culture, it's not in your DNA, right? That's what they're telling us. And then when I look at Islamist extremists, they're saying exactly the same thing.
Yeah.
If you come from a Muslim identity, they say, these are not your values because they don't belong in our culture. Actually, they're saying the same thing. I think what we need to tell is women's rights, democracy, rule of law, freedom of speech, these are not European values. These are universal values. There's no East and West or North and South about it. Everyone in the world deserves to live in a proper egalitarian system where there is freedom of speech. So I think we need to emphasize the universality of this. And we need to be careful about this cultural, territory that they are putting us in.
Yeah.
I understand sometimes, I hear people saying, well, feminism is a Western concept. Again, I say, no, there's no such thing. The equality, the struggle for gender equality is universal. However, at the same time, I'm also aware of the gaps within women's movement, and we need to work on those gaps as feminists. We need to talk about the next stage of feminism. So there are class barriers that we need to overcome. There are cultural gaps that we need to be aware of. I think a proper women's movement needs to definitely go hand in hand with LGBT rights.
Yeah.
But more than that, I think a proper pluralistic women's movement today has to go out and reach to men. And this is, again, a big challenge for us. I need to be able to talk about masculinity. I need to also understand that in a patriarchal culture, and I think patriarchy is universal, but there are different degrees of patriarchy. I think in a patriarchal culture, of course, women are unhappy, but men are unhappy as well. And especially if you're a young man who doesn't conform to the given description of masculinity, for whatever reason, your life can be very difficult. And unfortunately, sometimes women can take part in shunning men who don't conform to hegemonic masculinity.
Yeah.
So there's a lot we need to talk about, and we need to bring men on board. To me, this is incredibly important.
Yeah. Do you think it's because we have not one feminism, we have generations and there are gaps in their feminism.
Of course.
So I mean, how do we bridge these gaps in storytelling? I mean, you never mentioned once that to only write about identity from your own perspective and not look at other identities. Just like in your book, for example, we have so many different identities that come together. Do you think there are too much identity politics across feminism right now that separates the movement rather than...
Well, of course, it's not a monolithic whole, but I think we need to understand that at the core of feminism, in my opinion, there is humanism, and we forget this. Why do I say that? Because what we are saying is equality, dignity. No human being, no group of human being, no class of human being has the right to discriminate another group of human beings on the basis of sex, class, race, or any other reason. So that humanism for me is very simple but incredibly essential. Of course, we should be self-critical. We should always try to improve ourselves, but we should also understand that right now, the age we're living in, there's a huge backlash against women's rights. We can't be naive about this. There's a huge backlash against LGBT rights. Even in those countries that were regarded until recently very solid lands, there's no such thing. I mean, look at America, state after state, an extreme form of abortion ban. Even when it's a child that we're talking about, even when it's rape that we're talking about, even when the life of the mother is concerned, there's an extreme abortion ban on the table. So we need to talk about these things. Even in countries like Spain, that we never thought we would see this. Think about the Vox movement in Andalusia, nationalistic. They talk about the good old days of Franco, right? Returning. What do? This anti-feminist backlash is a big part of them. They hire these buses, maybe you've seen them, with a picture of Hitler on it, and then underneath hashtag feminazi, and then they ride this bus everywhere. Their argument is feminists have gone too far. You know, they destroyed traditional family values. We need to wage a war against feminism. This is going on in Italy as well. Like they're organizing these family conferences. So there's a very systematic backlash. And I think when we talk about populism, we are aware that it's anti-liberal, anti-pluralistic. In my opinion, in the long run, it's anti-democratic. But sometimes we fail to see that it's anti-intellectual, and also it's anti-feminist, it's anti-women's rights, anti-LGBT rights. So there's a big backlash. And I want to add maybe one more thing. Until recently, I think we divided the world. Many people in the West did this. They thought some parts of the world were solid lands and other parts were the troubled parts. And they thought feminism was needed there. I have met people who told me when I was living in Istanbul that it was very understandable for me to be a feminist because I lived in Turkey. And the American journalists who told me this never thought that feminism might also be needed in America, or human rights struggle might also be needed in America. That's all I'm saying. And we need to understand that there is a backlash right now in the year 2019.
It is. And your role for Turkish women, I mean, right now, how is it to be in that role, that you are such a role model, you are a speaker, you put emphasis on that a lot lately, especially on social media. Don't you have a fear? I mean, there have been, I think most of us are aware of what the Turkish government have done with your books and stuff. Don't you, I mean, the question is, do you have a fear for yourself? I mean,
I think we all have fears and anxieties, and particularly writers are very anxious
but what
creatures.
are your fears then? I mean,
well, I have so many anxieties. But here's what happens. I write novels. I'm a fiction writer. And the novel is a very democratic space. I think as writers, we do not control that space. You know, there's a flow that I respect. Sometimes when you want to keep a character on the side, I realize she doesn't listen to me. You know, she's become a central...
Yeah.
So all I'm saying is we don't dominate the narrative.
No.
When I give the book to my editor, sometimes I worry about what people might say, but then it's too late. The book is born and it has a life of its own, and I have to respect that. This novel, some of my work actually is being right now investigated by prosecutors in Turkey, not only me, other authors as well, for crime of obscenity, but for writing about issues like sexual harassment or child abuse or gender-based violence. But how can I not write about these issues? These are the realities in my motherland, you know?
Yeah.
So to me, the tragedy is instead of changing the patriarchal laws, instead of opening shelters for abused women and children, instead of really doing something about it, because Turkey has a huge problem when it comes to gender-based violence. The cases of gender-based violence increased 1,400%. 1,400% increase in the last 10 years. So instead of dealing with that, the fact that they are investigating fiction writers, to me, is very sad.
And that's interesting, because in Denmark we have some authors, young authors, both from Turkey, Pakistan, Palestinian, and when they tend to talk about these taboos or their identity or social issues, they're often praised by the majority as being brave and as well, and their own minority rejects them. I mean, what would your advice be to those future writers or those who want to write as truthfully as they can and as you, I mean, in a way, because you are a French.
You know, in the beginning we talked about multiple belongings.
Yeah.
To me, it is important, and I sincerely believe we all have multiple belongings. When I look at myself, of course I'm an Istanbulite. I'm very attached to Istanbul. I'm very attached to Turkish culture, history, particularly women's culture, oral culture. But at the same time, I'm attached to the Aegean. you know, and to the Balkans. So put me next to a Greek author or a Romanian, Bulgarian, Bosnian author, I have a lot in common. I have elements in my soul from the Middle East, so I have a lot in common with the Lebanese, Syrian, Iranian, Persian or author or someone coming from Iraq, for instance. But equally, I'm a European by birth, by choice, the values that I share. Over the years, I've become a Londoner. Over the years, I've become a British citizen. I feel attached and I care about that country. And at the same time, despite what Theresa May has been saying, I would like to think of myself as a world citizen, as someone who's attached to the globe, thinks on a global scale. The reason I'm telling you this is because we don't have one single thread that gives us a sense of belonging. We have multiple belongings. That doesn't mean we don't care about one culture. It means we care about many things simultaneously at the same time. So when we write, I know, particularly nationalists are always angry.
Yep.
I mean, one of my earlier novels is called The Bastard of Istanbul, and it talks about Armenian genocide. And when the book came out, I was put on trial in Turkey for talking about it. But at the same time, I also had an amazing feedback and warmth from the readers. So I've seen both sides of it. You know, so that's why instead of thinking in nationalistic terms, I think we need to think about truth and the truths that have been silenced and erased.
Very good.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think. I would like to talk about what authors and books have made an impression on you,
I think so.
formed you.
So many, and maybe my reading lists have always been eclectic, you know. I'm just a curious reader, and I don't like this distinction between highbrow literature, lowbrow literature, who decides. You know, I think we can read anything, everything. We should read cookbooks, we should read whatever talks to us in that moment in time. We should be able to read it without fear of judgment. But one thing is crucial to me, and I ask this question to myself: why is it that so many experts, right? So many knowledgeable people got so many things wrong over and over and over again. So think about the financial crisis. They didn't see it coming, or the Euro crisis, or Trump election, or Brexit, or the Arab Spring. If you remember the predictions when the Arab Spring started, it was nothing like what it turned out to be in the end. So the question is, how is it possible that people who are experts in their fields keep getting things wrong?
That's it.
And I think part of the answer is because we fail to connect the dots.
Yeah.
You know, everybody knows their own fields very well, incredibly well. They go in depth. But what we fail to see is, you might know economy very well, but if you don't also know politics, then you can't analyze, the world, or vice versa. That is why I think it's always intellectually, even spiritually, better for us to be challenged. So I think fiction writers should not only be reading fiction. Of course, we should read novels always, but in addition, to me, it's much more intriguing when a fiction writer reads neuroscience, something I know nothing about. Allow that to challenge me. Or when a neuroscientist loves poetry, or when a poet loves political science, or when a political scientist becomes interested in film theory and cinema. How do we respond to knowledge that comes from outside of our fields? Yeah. Those are the conversations across disciplines and across cultures. Those are the conversations that I think keep us intellectually and maybe spiritually more connected and help us to understand better the world.
Yeah, and then my question comes, is it an advantage for you as a political scientist as well, and author? And I mean, in this book, I won't go into it, but there's a lot of history. There is some social, economic, there's also you have a lot of historical events that happened throughout the life of Leila. Is that an advantage for you as a writer when you are both a professor?
It was a challenge for me, honestly, mostly because political science is a very data-driven discipline. I think there's a lot of data fetishism in political science. Yeah. I am not underestimating in any way the importance of research and studies, but all I'm saying is there are things in this life like emotions, like perceptions, feelings, culture, that are not easily measured, and turned into quantitative data. And unfortunately, a lot of political science turns a blind eye to that. No wonder then that we fail to grasp the complexity of today's changes, because most of the clashes we are experiencing today take place in the field of culture. We're experiencing cultural clashes within each and every country. So we need a new narrative. And I think we need to talk about emotions. Emotions matter. Fear, anxiety, resentment, frustration. We don't even have a language to talk about this in the academic community. So those gaps bother me a lot. And maybe I make a distinction between information, knowledge, and wisdom. I think we live in an age in which we have too much information, and we can't deal with it, we can't process it. And we have less knowledge, even less wisdom. So we need to change the ratio. Definitely less information, because we don't even connect with too much information. But knowledge is better for us. By knowledge, I mean to be lonely, alone, read books, in-depth analysis. But then wisdom is something else altogether, and I think wisdom requires emotional intelligence. We need to be able, we shouldn't be ashamed of our emotions. We see emotions as a sign of weakness, and it affects women a lot, especially women politicians or women in the public space, because we want to prove that we are tough. And I think that's a lot of pressure on our souls. So let those emotions come out. And I think it really pisses me off that many times populist demagogues do a better job in terms of connecting with people's emotions than their liberal counterparts. So we have to change our narrative.
Thank you. What do you learn from your readers? I'm thinking about Twitter especially and social media. What do they give you back? Because I know you're a lot on Twitter, especially.
Social.
And it can be, it can be very toxic to be on Twitter. But I think I've noticed that you have a lot of activism as well. That when you're telling people what's going on in Turkey, for example, if there's something in Hong Kong, you have been very vocal about that. So do you feel that your readers come and engage with you in these?
I think social media is like the moon, isn't it? It has a bright side, for sure, but it has a very dark side as well. And for a very long time, because we over-romanticize the bright side, we fail to see its dark side. You will remember, especially in early 2000s, there was so much optimism about social media, digital technologies, and most of that tech optimism was projected into the Middle East. So when the uprisings happened in Iran, people called it Twitter rebellion. And there were New York Times columnists saying, from now on, the youth in Iran will be firing tweets to topple down dictators. When Arab Spring started, people were predicting that Facebook was going to bring democracy to the entire region. So much so that a young Egyptian couple named their newborn baby daughter Facebook at the time. Because to them, it was very precious. And at the same time, a family in Israel, I remember it very vividly, they named their third child, again to honor Facebook, they named their third child Like. Right?
Wow.
So today I think about those two children who are almost teenagers, Facebook in Egypt and Like in Israel. What are their lives like? Because I think, fast forward, we have entered the age of pessimism, anxiety, and that optimism has evaporated. The reason why I'm mentioning is because, of course, there's a lot of toxicity on the digital platforms, which we should be very aware of. Especially, we should be very alert about the spread of misinformation. We need to become engaged citizens. I think Hannah Arendt very much wanted that. We need to remember what she said, what she warned us against. But that also means we need to become active digital citizens, which means it doesn't mean you have to be on Twitter, but at least not to spread misinformation, not to spread hatred, to be aware of what the digital world is doing to us in terms of spreading, dividing us into groups and spreading sometimes messages of hatred through algorithms. So we can't be naive about the dark side of social media. But at the same time, it has a bright side as well,
Yeah.
particularly for women, for minorities, for, as you said, sharing information. It has a much more egalitarian basis,
Yeah.
but to be aware of both the bright and the dark side is the only thing we can do.
Yeah, because you have, I was, when Twitter yesterday, I'm totally new to Twitter,
Yeah.
1.7 million
Yeah.
followers you have. I mean, that's a huge voice you have. Yeah. In the end, I would just like to ask, do you think that literature can create cultural change in for example, Turkey or Pakistan, or let's say in America? Do you really believe in that?
I think culture...
Because we live in
Yeah.
pessimist times, and we
Yeah.
live in where we
Yeah.
do not want to read. We want to look at Facebook and Twitter and all these.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah. Yeah.
is literature
Yeah.
going to change that?
I think culture matters, not only literature, but of course to me literature is the closest to my heart. I think stories matter. You know, when I read the memoirs of people who have survived the darkest chapters in human history, like the Holocaust, like genocides, like civil wars, there's something very interesting that I see in their writing. These people are asking one fundamental question. How is it possible that horrific things happen in human history? Is it because people are evil? And then the answer they give is no. You know, there are some evil people, but relatively speaking, their numbers is very small. But then how is it possible that horrific things keep happening? So their answer is, we need to understand the opposite of goodness is not evil. The opposite of kindness is not, unkindness. They're saying the opposite of goodness is numbness, is when we become numb, is when we become indifferent, desensitized, when I stop caring about what's happening in Myanmar, in Hong Kong, right, in Syria. The moment I stop caring, that is a fertile ground for a small number of bad people to do bad things because nobody responds anymore. So I think apathy is a very, very dangerous thing. It's much more dangerous than hatred, and we need to be aware of that. I'm not a very optimistic person by nature. I'm Turkish. It's not in my genes.
Yeah.
We're not very optimistic. There are, I think, two things we don't do very well in Turkey. One is irony. The other is optimism. I also think if you open a map of Europe and if you trace it with your finger, the blue Danube, as you move from Germany towards the Black Sea, I think the level of optimism drops. Yeah. So when you reach Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary, Turkey, we're not very optimistic. Yeah. But I wanted to share this because I think it's okay for the mind to be pessimistic, I think there's a metaphor that Gramsci uses. He used to talk about the pessimism of the mind, but the optimism of the heart. And I think we live in an age in which the mind has to be pessimistic so that we can understand what's happening, how we can go backwards fast, but the heart has to remain optimistic. And that optimism is going to come from our fellow human beings. When you talk to people, young people, minorities, that will give us faith.
Definitely. And when I finished your book, I instantly thought about if Beale Street could talk.
Yeah.
Because there's a child born in the end. Yeah. I mean, I can't remember the sentence. And what you just said about dark optimism, I mean, I could feel that in this book all the way through, even though I was like, okay, this is going to be, there's a lot of love and every feeling, but I hope that that the story of Layla will be told. There are hundreds and thousands of Laylas living right now in the world.
Of course.
And I think that we need to talk more about feminism, activism, and we need more women like you, I mean, to spread these messages across the world. In the end, I would just, a short question, which would be, what is your dream? I know it's a big question, but let's talk about feminism. I mean, just a small thing that we could take away from here when we walk out. What can we do as an individual? And when we walk out of here, what is the change that we want to create?
I think it's a very powerful question because as individuals, we are feeling powerless, right? We're made to feel powerless. So much is happening in the world, and then we say to ourselves, well, what can I do? In Britain right now, there's a syndrome called Brexit fatigue. You know, it's true, after 3 years, it affects 40% of the population, and people are saying, I don't want to hear Brexit anymore. I'm so sick and tired. But that's not a good way forward either, because the moment we feel tired, fatigued, powerless, we're not contributing to social change. So maybe my dream, for myself as well, it's a challenge. I know it's a daily challenge, but how can we be more involved? How can we move forward? And how can we learn from the mistakes of the past and hopefully never ever again make the mistakes of ultranationalism, ultra-religiosity, and any kind of tribalism that divided human beings and created hatred and animosity. We shouldn't go down that tunnel.
So, now you know. That's what you train.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.